Hey guys, in this video I'm going to go over our current luxury photography camera settings. Although we use Sony cameras, most of these settings will work for most mirrorless and DSLR cameras. You should be able to find similar settings regardless of what camera you are shooting with. Now, if you're versed in photography, know the ins and outs of camera settings, and want to spend more time fine-tuning each shot, feel free to shoot in manual mode and manually adjust all your camera settings for each shot. Now, with luxury photography, you will have to make minor camera setting adjustments from shot to shot, but our goal has always been to set our camera settings as simple as possible for our media specialists so that they can get up and running and start shooting excellent luxury photography as soon as possible. With our default luxury photography settings, you'll only have to manage 4 variables when at the property. These variables are composition, aperture, ISO, and flash settings. Now, we also manage the shutter speed, but we do so by adjusting the aperture and ISO settings. Now let's talk about our default camera settings. Aperture set to 7.1, ISO set to 100, white balance set to auto, focus mode set to auto, focus area set to wide, drive mode set to single shot or 2-second timer, file format set to compress raw, and lens distortion compensation is set to auto. Now, these are our default camera settings. With regards to aperture, we usually keep it at around 7.1 by default. That being said, we'll shoot between f4 and f13 depending on the shot. Now, before you go out and shoot at f4, make sure that your lens performs well at that aperture setting. We use high-end Sony lenses that have excellent optics. I've also tested other lenses that did not perform well at lower aperture settings, so make sure to test your specific lens to make sure it performs. When it starts to get dark outside, we lower our aperture setting to allow more light into the camera and to keep the shutter speed relatively fast. Once we hit our lower aperture limit and shutter speed start to creep up again, we then increase our ISO settings to keep our shutter speed manageable. You only have so much time to capture all the shots you plan on getting, and having a faster shutter speed will help you accomplish that. We typically will increase our ISO settings up to 320 for luxury photography. With the camera settings that we use beyond ISO 320, we start to see a little bit more noise or grain in the shadows during the editing process. That being said, there are times where we have to push our ISO setting beyond 320, but in general, we try to keep it as low as possible. Now let's talk about white balance. For the most part, we leave our white balance set to auto. White balance is easily adjustable during the editing process as long as you're shooting in the raw file format. From time to time, you may run into a home where the colors don't look very accurate in camera. For those homes, you may want to select a specific white balance setting. Now, which white balance setting you choose to use will depend on the home's lighting condition and the time of day. For most twilight shoots, that setting is going to be incandescent. Now let's talk about focus settings. By default, our focus mode is set to automatic and the focus area is set to wide. Now, these focus settings work for most shooting scenarios. If you're shooting multiple exposures of the same angle, you may want to consider using manual focus. There have been times where my lens changed the focus distance between exposures and made the shot unusable. Having this happen is pretty rare, especially when shooting with Sony wide-angle lenses. This issue doesn't happen enough for me to change from shooting auto to manual focus. In my opinion, it's riskier to have your lens set to manual and forget to focus it properly than to use autofocus. You may also want to consider changing your focus area to a specific point instead of wide should you run into this issue. Now let's talk about drive mode. We set our drive mode to single shot or to the 2-second self-timer mode. If you're pressing the camera shutter button, you'll want to turn on the 2-second timer so that you don't accidentally create camera shake when pressing the button. I like to use a remote when shooting, so typically I have my camera drive mode set to single shot. You may want to select a longer self-timer if there's a reflection and you need more time to get out of the shot. Now let's talk about file format. We set our file format to compressed raw. I've done many side-by-side testing between compressed and uncompressed raw, and it's hard to tell the difference between the two. You can shoot uncompressed raw, just know that the file sizes are going to be roughly twice the size. Also, one setting that's not turned on by default in Sony cameras is lens distortion compensation. You want to make sure that this setting is set to auto. What this does is remove the lens distortion in camera from your images as long as the camera can recognize the lens you're shooting with. Now during the shoot, you're going to have to manage your external flash output settings as well. Make sure to watch the job shadows to get a good grasp on managing your flash from shot to shot. By default, when shooting the exteriors, our flashes are typically set to a quarter power or half power. We also use full power. Just know that the recycle times are going to be slower at full power and can make it harder to manage multiple flashes during a single exposure. Now for interiors, the flash power setting depends on the size of the room. We're usually anywhere between 1/64 and full power. Alright guys, so these are the default luxury photography settings that we currently use here at Lister Pros. Feel free to adjust the settings as you see fit or shoot in full manual mode. These settings have worked well for us and they are a good starting point. At the end of the day, the important thing isn't necessarily your camera settings, but that you deliver a consistent product and a great experience to your customers. Alright guys, that's going to do it for our luxury photography settings video. If you guys have any additional questions, feel free to reach out. We'll see you guys on the next one.